Hi, so I wanted to spend some time and go over a sample research essay for you. This one was submitted a couple of semesters ago and did a really good job. It is a student essay, so it's not perfect, but the student does a good job of doing what this assignment requests. So I wanted you guys to be able to see this. This paper is titled Understanding Grief. Notice that it is in MLA format, so we have last name and page number. Of course, that would be your last name there. Their name, my name, the course, and the date. And then we have our title. So here's what it says. Benjamin Franklin once said, "Nothing is certain except death and taxes. Eventually, every person will have to grieve for someone they love. It could be a grandparent, a parent, a spouse, or a child. Grief is universal. Whatever form it takes, it is real and raw for everyone who experiences it." Anthropologists have studied many cultures across the world. Every study comes up with the same findings. In whatever society or culture that is being observed, those that have lost a loved one always attempt to somehow regain the loved one. There's also a spiritual belief in an afterlife where people expect to someday be reunited with their loved one. The two terms that are used frequently around the death of a loved one are bereavement and grieving. Bereavement covers everything surrounding and leading up to the death of a loved one. It can be the anticipation, death, and subsequent adjustment to living following the death of a loved one. Grief, on the other hand, refers to the more specific, complex set of cognitive, emotional, and social difficulties that follows the death of a loved one. Age and circumstance can have an influence on the way people grieve. For example, those that lose a child to suicide grieve more intensely than those that lose a spouse late in life. Grief can take many faces and shapes. It can take the form of a man who throws himself into his work after losing a child. It could be the widow who isolates herself from society and grieves all alone, or the child who loses a parent and acts out at school. Gender, circumstances, and age affect the way people grieve. Okay, so here we have our introductory paragraph, and this student did a really good job of setting up grief and the different ideas about grief that she's going to explore in this paper. She talks about how grief is universal. Everyone at some point will have to deal with grief. She talks about the different ways groups of people and cultures deal with grief, such as trying to keep that loved one with them or the anticipation of an afterlife. She talks about the fact that circumstance certainly does, in fact, influence how we grieve. The way a person died can shape the way we grieve. And ultimately, she closes with a really simple thesis. Gender, circumstance, and age affect the way people grieve. This is going to be her argument that she's making here. Even though this is a simple thesis, it's really building upon these last couple of sentences and the examples she's using here. All right, let's go into her first body paragraph. Everyone at some point will grieve. It's part of the human experience, and it happens in stages. In her book, The Year of Magical Thinking, Joan Didion perfectly describes grief. She writes, "People who have recently lost someone have a certain look, recognizable maybe only to those who have seen that look on their own faces. It is the look of someone who walks from the ophthalmologist's office into the bright daylight with dilated eyes. Grief can present itself differently to everyone. However, our experiences are rarely linear. It has been identified that people grieve in stages. There are 5 stages that are observed. They are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. However, people may not experience the stages of grief in this order because everyone is different. Eventually, people will experience at least one of these stages. Denial is the first stage that many people experience. A person might have a hard time wrapping their hand around the tragedy that occurs. Denial can help the grieving person process the information at a pace they mentally and emotionally can handle. Anger is the second stage of grief. Not everyone who grieves experiences this emotion second. For example, anger may be the first reaction. Anger is a natural reaction to the death of a loved one. A person may feel anger for many reasons. It could be they feel cheated, that their time with their family member was cut short, or even anger toward healthcare workers who could not save their loved one. Anger is a healthy emotion because it means the person is bridging the gap between the numb state of denial and the path of healing. The bargaining stage of grief is challenging. At this point, the survivor is asking themselves questions such as what could they have done to stop it from happening? The person would give anything for just one more day. They might even begin to place blame either on themselves or others for what happened. Bargaining keeps those who are grieving reliving the past and eventually leads to the fourth stage of depression. Depression is a normal and natural part of losing a loved one. The person finally accepts that the loved one is not coming back. Depression can have powerful mental and physical effects on the body. Depression will eventually subside, but if it goes on for too long, the person may need to seek professional help. The last is acceptance. The person fully realizes that the loved one is not coming back. They start to move on with their lives. This can come with the feelings of guilt as they start to live and enjoy life. Their life will never be the same and will always be different, but life will take on a new normal. So in this paragraph, we're really going through what the stages of grief are so that we can understand them. She starts off talking about this quote from John Didion and moves into her research, her more concentrated research. Notice that she's using a combination of quotes as well as paraphrasing and summaries to get her points across. With MLA, keep in mind that you are required to cite with an in-text citation. So here's your in-text citation. When you use a quote, when you summarize, or when you paraphrase. So keep that in mind. All right, let's move into our next body paragraph. Research affirms that men and women grieve differently. In an article by J. Scott Jansen, a licensed clinical social worker, he looks at the way men grieve and why. He found in his research that the male grieving pattern is influenced not only by genetics, but also by environment and society as a whole. Men, throughout their lives, are taught what acceptable behavior is. Jansen quotes psychologist Judith Stillion regarding the different messages boys and girls receive throughout childhood. Stillion proposes that boys receive 4 fundamental messages about what it means to be a man and what constitutes proper male behavior. Stillion goes on to tell the reader what these 4 messages are. They are that men must be strong and not show vulnerability. A man must be in control of a situation and not ask for help. A man must protect and keep his loved ones safe. And lastly, a man must not show fear in the face of challenges. These unspoken ideals of the perfect man permeate society and have an impact on grief in males. Jansen indicates that there is evidence that men are more likely than women to remain silent or grieve in isolation, engage in action-oriented forms of grief expression, or lose themselves in distractions such as work. Women, on the other hand, tend to outwardly show their grief. One study found that women cried much more than fathers and were more likely to cope by writing and reading about loss and grief. A theory of the reason women may grieve differently than men is that women tend to have strong social network and they reach out for support during times of grief. Women by nature tend to value female friendships and have many close friends. This may be one positive influence in their grieving process. Despite having this strong social network, a study conducted on elderly bereaved spouses found that bereavement was harder on women than men. There are always exceptions to the rule, but perhaps grief might be harder on women due to their deeply emotional nature. Women tend to wear their hearts on their sleeves and form strong attachments. This could affect the intensity of their grief. Among all the research and studies that have been done on men and women and grief, it is possible that maybe the difference is not so much in the experience of grief itself, but in how the pain of grief is absorbed, processed, and expressed. So here in this paragraph, we really see her moving from background into her points for her argument. And in this one, she's going to argue that gender affects how a person grieves. And she goes through the details about how men grieve and how women grieve. Notice here that early on in the paragraph, she quotes a writer, or she quotes a person who said a quote in someone else's article. So she quotes Stillion, who was printed in Jansen's, the article she read by Jansen. So her in-text citation says QTD period in Jansen. This shows that this quote was used in this article that's on the works cited page. All right, let's move into her next point. The age of a person has an impact on the way people feel grief. Children act very differently from adults upon learning about the death of someone close. A child can be playing with friends or toys for hours after learning of the death of someone they love. This emotional numbness can be a way of protecting their feelings from the deep emotional hurt they may be experiencing. Children also tend to act out while grieving. It's hard for them to make sense of all the different emotions they may be feeling, and children may have temper outbursts, become unusually loud, initiate fights, defy authority, or simply rebel against everyone. One of the hardest age periods to have to work through grief might be adolescence. Adolescence is a turbulent time of change. Teenagers are undergoing major physical and psychological changes, and these only add to the stresses of grieving. Teenagers also have great academic pressures on them. This is a time where the work to get accepted into a good college is paramount. Adolescents have to survive all the pressures on them from the academic world and social pressures, all the while surviving the death of their loved one. Teenagers should not be expected to grieve as adults do. They still undoubtedly depend on those relationships around them for emotional support. Teenagers should be treated as any grieving child would, with love and understanding. In stark contrast to the adolescent years and those of the elderly, a study done on the population of New Zealanders ranging from 71 to 90 years of age were asked about their grief experiences as an older adult. Those who participated in the study cited a combination of being older and previous life experiences as factors that had enabled them to cope with these largely expected events. Citizens have a lot of life experience under their belts, and this life experience seems to help them cope with losing loved ones. Many of this older generation just understand that death is a part of life and view it as both a natural and expected event. As senior citizens get older, it becomes almost the norm to see those friends and loved ones die. This attitude of acceptance helps the older generation grieve. Okay, so here we see her going through the way people grieve, and she goes through children, she goes through teenagers, and then she gets into the elderly. And she talks about these three different categories because they handle grief very differently based on the situations that they are experiencing. So this helps us to understand how age influences one's grieving process. Her next point: the circumstance of death have a significant effect on how people grieve. The attachment to the deceased will play a big role in the grief process. A spouse who is killed suddenly in a car accident will be grieved differently than a grandparent who dies naturally. The nature of the attachment to the deceased will also be a mediator in how strong the grief response is, since the intensity of grief is determined by the intensity of love. The circumstance of how the person died will also have a great impact. Sudden deaths are reacted to much more strongly than a person who dies after a terminal illness. Certain types of death, like suicide and the death of a child, elicit a much stronger grief response. In his book, Grief Counseling and Grief Therapy, William Worden quotes Edwin Schneidman, who is considered the father of the suicide prevention movement in the United States. Schneidman explains he believes that the person who commits suicide puts his psychological skeletons in the survivor's emotional closet. He sentences the survivors to deal with many negative feelings. Worden tells the reader that there is some evidence that grief in suicide bereavement may be more intense and last longer than grief for other types of losses. Those left behind with a loved one who commit suicide experience feelings of shame, guilt, and anger. They wonder what they could have done to prevent the suicide and may feel guilty for this. They may feel angry at their family member for committing suicide and leaving them behind. Parents never expect to outlive their children, so the death of a child can be particularly heartbreaking. Studies have shown evidence that the greatest stress, and often the most enduring one, occurs for parents who experience the death of a child. Parents' dreams and hopes for their children's future die. The parents have to grieve not only the loss of the child, but the death of those dreams. Most parents claim that the grieving continues as long as they live, often saying it gets different, it doesn't get better. Okay. So in this paragraph, we look at different circumstances. We talk about a spouse who's killed in a car accident versus an elderly person who dies naturally. She talks about suicide as well as the death of a child, and these are all different circumstances that would affect how one grieves. Now she's going to close out her paper. Grief in its simplest form is painful, physically and emotionally. It is something that all must pass through at some point in their lives, yet the way one grieves varies immensely. Men grieve differently than women, and children grieve differently than seniors. The circumstances surrounding grief change the intensity of grief as well. A person who dies of old age will produce a far less intense grieving process for their family members than a child who dies suddenly while young. Grieving can produce an array of different emotions such as loneliness, anger, denial, bitterness, shame, and depression. Eventually, most everyone will come to accept the death of and the grieving process will ease. Grief is a part of the human existence, and how one processes it, how one passes through it, depends on many factors in that person's life. So here she closes it out, reiterating her points and really bringing it to the broader discussion, which is that grief is unique, and it really, how one processes the grief is different based on circumstance, age, and who it is that's dying, why they're dying, gender, those sorts of things. Notice in this paper that it's clear that she has derived her topic from 10 Things that was written by Leslie Petrick, but not once in this paper does she mention 10 Things. This is a good model for your paper. You are not writing a literary analysis essay. You are writing a research paper. So your story should not have any great impact on your writing of your essay. The story was simply a springboard to get an idea. So for her, this student, she had read the story, connected to 10 Things because she had experienced a death that particular semester earlier in the semester. So she wanted to learn more about the grieving process. And so this is how she formatted her paper, how she came to her topic, and how she went about it. She also has a works cited page. Notice that her works cited page, the title is centered. Her sources are alphabetical. Notice the indentation and spacing. This is what your indentation and spacing should look like. I do want to point out that this essay is about 2,000 words long. Your essay requirement is less than this this semester. So you'll want to work in the parameters of what your assignment is requiring of you. I hope this essay helps. And if you have any questions about the video, the essay, what I went over, please let me know.